Welcome to another episode of the Kubik Report. Thank you for joining us. Today, my guest is Tim Pebworth. Tim and I have known each other going on several decades. I've known his family, I know his children, I know his mother. Tim is a person who is very involved with the French work. Tim serves as pastor for United Church of God congregations in France, as well as senior pastor for French-speaking areas in West Africa and advisor to church leaders in French-speaking countries around the world. Along with his wife, Maurice, he directs the development of print and web media for the United Church of God in the French language, including the bi-monthly French edition of the Beyond Today magazine. And currently, he is in the Ivory Coast, or how it's pronounced, Côte d'Ivory, which I am sure that I have not said properly. Tim's wife, Maurice, grew up in Paris, and they met in California when she came to the United States for university. And since that time, this is very interesting, Tim has become a naturalized French citizen, and Maurice a naturalized American citizen, and they split their time between Seattle, where they currently live in the U.S., and Bordeaux, with Tim traveling regularly to West Africa. He has an extended family, very involved in the work of God. And also an interesting point that Tim's daughter, Sophie, attended Ambassador Bible College when I was teaching a class in general epistles. And I really enjoyed her inquisitive mind and questions for the class that I taught. She was always there with questions that sometimes I could not fully answer, but that was the way Sophie's style was. Very good, and I enjoyed being able to look up answers when she asked questions. So welcome to the Kubik Report, Tim.
Yeah, great. It's great to be here. I'm glad it worked out that even though I was traveling here in West Africa and I'm in Abidjan and what's called Côte d'Ivoire. I know it sounds really kind of strange there, but yeah, Ivory Coast in French. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm so glad that we're able to finally make this because we've been wanting to do this podcast now for, as I mentioned, since January of this year. And right. I have visited with you at your home when you lived in Silicon Valley. What was the name of the town that you lived in there?
We lived in Santa Clara, basically at the bottom of the San Francisco Bay there.
Right. And my wife and I enjoyed a very, very special several days staying with the Pebworths and finding out more about the work that he's doing in the French-speaking areas. But we would like to know, I think that a lot of people who hear your name would like to know, what is your role and the scope of your work and where you do work? Because right now, as you mentioned, as I spoke in the introduction, you are spending your time between Seattle, which is your U.S. domicile, and Bordeaux, France. So maybe you can explain that, Tim.
Sure. Yeah. It's been about 6 years now since I transitioned from my role as a chief financial officer in Silicon Valley to being a pastor. So that's quite a transition, CPA to pastor that way. And Maurice and I actually started using our vacation time to work with members in France nearly 12 years ago. So it's kind of just been a progression of things. And right now, as you mentioned, responsible for spreading this wonderful message of the role of Jesus Christ in our life and the hope for the kingdom of God through the French-speaking world and the Francophone areas, as is often we refer to it. Pastoring for 2 churches, one in Bordeaux, obviously Bordeaux famous for its wine, and also where we have our church office, and another one in Narbonne, which sits about 5 hours to the southeast on the Mediterranean Sea. Mm-hmm. And I also pastor for scattered members throughout France. And I'll mention we have a weekly Sabbath service that we broadcast from Bordeaux via Zoom every Sabbath at 3 p.m. Central European Time, which is 9 a.m. on the East Coast in the United States. So any of your listeners who'd like to join us for services in French, we welcome them. We have visitors every week, both prospective members of the Church of God and also people who are members of the United Church of God. We've got people as far away of the island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean and Quebec and Europe and so forth.
Would like if you could send me the contact information of where people can connect to the services, and we'll include that with the notes with this podcast. People are very, very curious and would like to know. Obviously, French is one of the major languages in the world, and we're very grateful that we have continuously had in the Church of God a French-speaking division and people who have known the language. The problem is that not many people in the United States, including myself, know the French language. So it has to be that
Right.
particular group that speaks French, and they kind of knowingly communicate with one another. But you may want to tell us about the extent of the French work, how it has followed the French Empire, so to speak, because a lot of where your work is done in Africa. In fact, I think the bulk of your work and the membership is in Africa. So let's hear about the scope of the French-speaking areas, because France has, obviously the headquarters, so to speak, of the French. But
Right.
even then, Paris is not the chief principal city, but Bordeaux is. More of the recent history of the church, of the families, and the people. But give us a tour.
Yeah. Well, just like the British have the Commonwealth, and we often hear about this, so France has something called La Francophonie, or the Francophonie, which is an organization of countries around the world who either have French as their first language or as a important second language, or have a connection to France historically that is important, that they want to be part of it. For example, Ukraine is an observer in the Francophonie because of historical connections between Ukraine and France.
Mm-hmm.
And so today there are different estimates. One estimate puts the number of French speakers at about 320 million people in about 32 countries where it's either the first or second language. Most of those people, as you said, live in Africa. I often tell people, London is, you could say, the birthplace of English, and yet, New York is the largest English-speaking city in the world. Likewise, Paris, birthplace of French, but it's not the largest French-speaking city in the world. That would be Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there's only one city in France that meets, that is on the list of the top 20 largest French-speaking cities in the world. I'm here in Abidjan, which is the third largest city. So yeah, it sort of stretches around the world, and the work that I do and support for the church follows that. So I'm the senior pastor directly for 3 countries in West Africa, Benin and Togo, which are 2 very small countries which sit just west of Nigeria, and also this Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, which changed its name to follow the French back in the 80s, but it sits a little west of Ghana and borders Mali, Liberia, and we say Guinea, or Guinea. Yeah, I think we call it Guinea. Anyway, I might not have pronounced that correctly. It's in English. It's another country close to there. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so Ivory Coast is where I am now, and working with 2 congregations here, and we're doing some great work I can talk about. LifeNets has been helpful to the congregation in the north. We can talk about that, but just to kind of continue the tour, in Central Africa, I work with the regional pastor who lives in Cameroon, and I've visited many cities in Cameroon, including in the far north, right as the Sahara begins. You go up there, you see camels. Church starts at 8 a.m. because it's so incredibly hot. You're right on the border with Chad, really kind of getting into the Sahara. And then also a very interesting country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah.
And then finally now I've just begun to visit Madagascar, where we have a great deal of interest in the church. Work with Chuck Smith and Joseph Jean, and who's the deacon serving in Haiti. Work with Kubik in Canada. So it's really all around the world.
You really have an amazing network, even more, I would say, interesting. And it's an area that we know very little about, and it's just huge. It's like a huge wave, over us, but we don't understand very much about it. And we hear about people going there and activities taking place. And when I was senior pastor over Zambia, one area that we worked in a lot, in fact, one of our more productive areas, is a 4-church string between Kitwe, or Mufulira, and Maninga to the far west. And those cities were literally a mile or two from the border of the Congo, the DRC, the Democratic
Right.
Republic of the Congo. In fact, we had people come over from the DRC, and one of our churches really was very much a part of members or people that had come from them. So we've had that contact, and yet, as close as it was, and on the main highway as we drove, we could see the hills of the Congo. It was a whole galaxy away because of politics.
And I've driven on the other side of that border, and I've looked across, and again, it does feel like another galaxy away.
Mm-hmm. We had people who attended our services, and we were tempted at one point. I think that what's that huge city there, Lubumbashi?
That's right. We have a lot of people on Lumumbashi, but then there's Kasolambesa, which
Yes.
is the city that's right there on the border where we also have members, and they go across to Kitwe.
Uh-huh.
And really, Zambia is it's almost comparable, let's say, to the United States Mexico border, where you have a lot of opportunities in the United States, and people, they want to cross the border for opportunities. It's the same way people in the Congo want to cross the border into Zambia so they can get work.
Mm-hmm.
It's that kind of dramatic sort of level of economic opportunity, wealth and poverty.
Well, one thing that really struck me though is that while it was wealth and poverty in the DRC, what they were sitting on with all the copper mining was just huge wealth that was mined there on both sides, on the Zambia side and also on the Congo side. And yet the people did not benefit from that. In fact, the areas in Zambia where the copper is mined, the roads are all beat up. The trucks that haul the copper, the smelted copper, just beat the heck out of the roads there, and the people are just as poor. And so it was. It's just very sad to see an area like that, and maybe you could even comment on that as we continue the tour. So don't let me hold up the tour here.
No, no. Well, I mean, I would just say that this is really just shows the level of corruption, and also really just it moves you to pray thy kingdom come, because as you drive from Lubumbashi south towards the Zambian border, and what you do as you get closer to the border is the semi tractor trailer, what we say in the United States, 18-wheelers,
Mm-hmm.
are stopped in a line miles and miles and miles. And I've shown this video to people in France, where you just drive miles and miles of nothing but 18-wheelers lined up with cobalt and timber and all sorts of minerals, and they're all on their way through Zambia down to South Africa and then out onto the ocean to be shipped to China and the United States. And it's like the wealth of the nation is just being drained right from underneath them to be sent out, and all that wealth is accumulating to those who are at the sort of the highest echelons of government within the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the richest countries in the world in terms of mineral resources, and yet typically ranks in sort of the top 10 poorest and most dangerous places in the world. It's just heartbreaking.
We were even told that if we come to visit, and I very unlikely that I ever will, is that that it was best to cross the border not at the official border crossings, but at other crossings because they were a lot easier to cross. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that we have experienced with the DRC, and some of the greatest genocide ever in the world occurred a little over 100 years ago in the DRC. It was part of the Belgian.
That's right.
It was called the Belgian Congo, and the rulers in Belgium really just raped the country. They really did, and they just worked the people to death, and millions of people died. Millions of people died, and right now what's there is better, in big quotes, but it's a country that has a very, very rough start.
And we have members who are in Kinshasa, which is the capital city, and then it's an enormous country. If you put Kinshasa, let's say, in San Francisco, Lubumbashi would be in Minnesota. That gives you kind of an idea of the size of the country, and yet it's a country that's pretty much without any infrastructure, limited roads, and I tried to go there once in 2018, and they told me my visa was not valid. I was detained by the police, and you can imagine being detained in a country like that by the police. And I was put right back on the plane and sent back to France. It was a little frightening at times, but finally was able to get into the country just before the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
and to just see the as you described, the legacy of that kind of corruption, that legacy of that kind of abuse. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they use the U.S. dollar, which, literally you go to the bank and there's an ATM that has U.S. dollars and an ATM that has Congolese francs. But the Congolese franc is used for only really small things. If you want to do anything, you have to use dollars. And so, you can easily spend $20, $50 a day, even sometimes $100 a day in bribes. You go to the airport, you want to park in the parking lot. The person says, "What are you going to do for me?" And so you have to bribe the parking attendant to park your car in the airport. You get to the terminal, and it's like a mafia where you can't check yourself in. You have to pay $20, and he takes your passport, takes your bags, and he goes to the counter and checks you in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty unsettling when you give your passport to a complete stranger. But that's the only way it works. And basically, they don't consider them bribes. They're just sort of service fees that you're paying as you're moving through the country.
As protection, I know that in Zimbabwe the same kind of thing was extant, where they would say, "We would like to protect your car." Now, if you didn't ask for that protection, the damage would come from the person who was offering protection.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly right.
But anyway, that's I know that the Congo is huge, placed over Europe. I had a map of the Congo on my website. In fact, I might post a few of the. I might mention a few of the postings that we had there about our work in the Congo. One of them, I featured a map of the Congo, overlaid Europe, and it really covers from Norway on down to Spain. It was just massive.
That's right. And as I said, a country without really any infrastructure, basic roads, even the internal airlines are not certified according to Western standards. And so you're advised to avoid flying internally because, we have worldwide standards in terms of maintenance of aircraft and security of airports. And it's just a country that just isn't able to attain any sort of basic standard.
Now, Africa, I think when we stayed with you, Tim, you mentioned that there's actually, is it true, more French in Africa than English, or am I wrong?
Well, yeah, it's definitely up there. And again, getting good information about all this stuff can be a little challenging. But you essentially have Swahili, French, and English as sort of the top three kinds of languages. And there's some debate as to whether French is more widely spoken than English, and it kind of depending on what source you look at. But most people don't appreciate just the extent to which French is spoken. And in fact, in 2014, The Guardian, newspaper in England, reported on a study that showed that based upon the continuing increase in population of sub-Saharan Africa, that French could be the most widely spoken language in the world by 2050. And that's really because you have a slowdown in the population of China. Obviously, Europeans are having fewer children, even in the United States. But a woman in sub-Saharan Africa still has 5, 6, or even 7 children. And those families, whether it's the Central African Republic, where we don't have any members, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the Republic of the Congo, or Cameroon, or even Senegal, where I am now, and Côte d'Ivoire, all these places continue to have very high birth rates, and they're all French speaking.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. It's also unfortunate. I don't want to be interjecting my things here too, but just my experience with Africa. When we started working in Malawi in 1996, the population of the country was 9 million. And last year, it was pushing 20 million. I mean, that's just in the period of time that I worked there, 25 years.
That's right.
And it's not stopping, and the country is poorer as a result. More forests have been cut down for charcoal and for fuel, and it's just a very sad state of affairs. Maybe you can comment about what the prognosis for French Africa is.
Well, right, and actually that brought to mind the country of Benin, where we do have members. Benin makes the list for the top 10 most illiterate countries in the world, and yet by the same token, they growing very quickly. So if you're a woman in Benin, you have likely only a 25% chance of being able to read. And a woman who is literate has fewer children than an illiterate woman. An illiterate woman also has a lower life expectancy because of the number of children that she has and because of the conditions that she's subjected to. And also, there's a certain independence that comes from being able to read. There's a certain way that you look at the world and we don't, in the United States and in the developed world, we don't often think about reading as a way that we interact with the world, but it changes the way we think about ourselves, the way we interact with others. So in Benin, we have a congregation in the commercial capital of Cotonou, which is just right near the border with Nigeria. And one of the projects we're doing there to sort of help in that way is setting up a school where we can teach English on a paid basis
Mm-hmm.
and teach French to illiterate women on an unpaid basis. And LifeNets Australia has stepped up, and they said that they're willing to support the school. There's different other donors that have said they're willing to step up on that, and that is a way that you can combat poverty, because if a woman is going to have 4 children versus 7, you can imagine the difference in terms of how much money is spent. And part of the reason that there's an illiteracy problem is these countries may have free education to age 12 or 14, but often the system by which you deliver that education is corrupted. So, for example, the books that you have to buy for school is a sole supplier from somebody in the government. And you can't reuse books. You know, in the United States, you might buy a book and then you could reuse it, or you could go to some forum and buy a used book. Well, that's not allowed. And the uniforms that the kids have
Mm-hmm.
to wear to school, that's a single supplier as well. And so obviously the prices are controlled. And so what happens is if you have 7 children, or even if you have 5 children, you can't afford books and uniforms for every child to go to school. So you have to make a choice. And as you would expect, what happens is the little boys get the opportunity to go to school and the little girls don't, because the boys can earn potentially more income to the family than the girls. The girls end up getting married off and going into another family. And so you get this cycle of poverty that you have to combat. And so also Benin is the home of voodoo. So that's kind of where it all started. We think about Haiti often with voodoo, but that just was brought across from Africa, and so
Mm-hmm.
you've got almost a half of the country which is worshiping ancestors, and people dressed up in different costumes, and summoning the spirits of ancestors and others. So it's a very challenging place for our members to live.
Well, one question I had is they are French speaking Africa, and it's called French Africa. But does pretty much everybody know French, or is that just the official language and people basically speak Swahili or local dialects? So, what's it
Oh
like?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think the term that's most often used is Francophone Africa. Obviously, the history of colonialism, whether you're talking about the British Empire or the French Empire, there's a lot of sensitivities to that. Even today, I want to say it's 10 or 11 countries are part of a common currency bloc called the Central African franc or the West African franc, and the reserves for that currency are held in Paris. So there's a very tight connection between these former French colonies and France, and in that way. So you've got this block of countries. and they all use this common currency. So you ask whether people in Francophone Africa all know French, or do they default to a local dialect? And
Right.
it depends on the country. Here, where I am right now in Côte d'Ivoire, there are over 70 languages spoken, and it's not that big of a country. You can imagine 70 different languages. And so French is a language that unifies the country. So
Mm-hmm.
if you live in the south of Côte d'Ivoire and you want to travel to the north, they're not going to speak your language. So
Mm-hmm.
you speak French, so you can move around. And French is the language of commerce. It's your phones are in French, all the signs are in French, the roadsides. So here in Ivory Coast, it's a little bit like India, where you have a lot of different languages, but really India is unified by English,
Mm-hmm.
and probably even more so even than India. So that's the case in Ivory Coast. In certain other countries like Togo, Togo was a German colony,
Oh. Uh-huh.
which Germany, yeah, it was a
Mm-hmm.
German, Cameroon too. They were both German colonies, which the Germans lost after the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody switched from German to French after the First World War, and they continued to speak French up to this day. But they had their local dialect. So if you go to church here in Ivory Coast, we all speak French. And tomorrow I'm going to church, and we'll be preaching in French. If you go to Togo, I speak French, and then I'm translated into the local language of Ewe,
Mm-hmm.
which is also the language of Ghana. So each country is a little bit different, but generally there is a little bit of interaction between a local tribal dialect and French.
I know that's what the situation in Zambia is. They have 49 languages. They have 7 major languages, and each one has about 7 dialects, I am told. And so when the British came there, they said, look, we've got to have order here. We'll make English
That's right.
the enforced official language, and still is today, where I speak whenever I go there, in the English language. It may be translated to some. They usually have a translator that speaks one of the local languages, a version of one of the languages that's also spoken in Malawi. But even I asked people in the church there that when you gather together, and even husband and wife, what do you speak to one another? And they said English, because that's they may not
Right.
know they may not know each other's language.
That's right, and that's a very good analogy to what I see here in West Africa. I'd mention in the case of Cameroon, Cameroon is a bilingual country like Canada, but Canada is primarily English speaking with a section that's French, whereas Cameroon is primarily French speaking with a section that's English. But unfortunately, in the case of Cameroon, that has led to a civil war. So there is what many call a low-level civil war going on between the English-speaking part of Cameroon that wants to succeed
Mm-hmm.
or secede, excuse
Mm-hmm.
me, and become its own country, and the Francophone part of Cameroon that wants it to maintain the integrity of the country. So this language issue can even lead to open conflict. And the situation in Cameroon, I guess I'll just mention something talking about Cameroon. The president of Cameroon, as I believe under most lists, is the longest serving president of any country in the world. He was elected in 1982, and he's been successively elected, for 7 terms, whatever length since then. He's almost 90 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and the country is just descending into a very difficult state there with the civil war, essentially a dictatorship, corruption, lack of infrastructure, and so again, the language plays a role, and we don't know how Cameroon will turn out. They may end up with, when the president dies, the English part may break off from the French speaking part.
Tim, I would like to go to 2 different other areas here. They are of special interest. One is I do not want to neglect your wife and her role. She was born French, and in either Paris or Bordeaux, I'm not sure which, but she is from France, and she does a lot of the work for the French Good News of the French Beyond Today magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could tell us about Maurice's work and perhaps how you kind of became integrated into it. You mentioned that you give sermons in French. Obviously, you are proficient in the language to be able to do that. I'd like to hear more
Right.
from you about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I definitely, obviously I'm so thankful for my wife, Maryse. We've been married coming up 34 years. She was actually born in Charente, which is known for its cognac and other things like that. It's sort of between Paris and Bordeaux on the west side of the country. She grew up in Paris. Her father worked for the French National Railway. She came to the United States when she was 21 years old, trying to figure out, English speak, how to speak English and converse in this in the United States. And she is the editor of the French edition of the Beyond Today magazine, which in French we call Pour l'avenir, which is translated directly as For the Future.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of the closest equivalent to Beyond Today. And we've been blessed to be able to actually register that trademark or that service mark under the Madrid Protocol, so we can use that around the world. So she's responsible for, and we work obviously very closely, but she has that primary responsibility to ensure that the translators and the proofreaders and working with printers and ensuring the distribution of that magazine. She also edits and reviews booklets that we produce in the French language. We've got more than 20 booklets, and we continue to produce about 2 booklets a year. So she's responsible to make sure that that's done. One thing about French, and if I can just say, is that the French are very proud of their language. French is the second most taught language in the world after English. And if you pick up a book, in fact, I have a book in my library. It was published in 1701 in Paris. I can pick up that book and I can read that book just as easily as I can read any French book today, because the French language has changed very little, because they're very careful about any new words that come in. There's a whole committee that agrees on what is an appropriate French word and what can be used. And of course, people make fun of that because, we use language the way we want to use language. But the French are very proud and also very picky. And so mistakes in the language, in writing, are taken very, very seriously. So it takes a lot longer to actually produce a booklet in French, because we just have to be so careful to make sure that we are grammatically correct and accurate in how we express things.
Well, I know that we who are not knowledgeable in French, and those who try to speak their perhaps corrupt version of French, are looked down upon snobbishly by the French. I mean, that's just kind of expected that the French that the French want you to speak correctly to them.
Well, what's interesting is that has certainly been the case. But now, especially if you go to France, the French beginning in school start learning English in first grade. So English is much more widely spoken. But there is a joke within French, within the French-speaking community, of who speaks the best French. And the Moroccans say they speak the best French, or the Cameroonians, or the Canadians, or whatever country you're going to say around the world, and you begin to pick out those accents, certainly.
Mm-hmm. What other areas are there in the French area that are significant? Like, for example, in Canada, Montreal, that is a French-speaking church, or is it French and English? What's it like?
Montreal is so interesting, and I just, especially for your North American listeners, if you have a chance to get to Montreal, I think you'll really enjoy it. It has sort of the feel of the United States, and yet signs are in French, and it has sort of a connection to France and to Europe that gives it a really unique flavor. We have a congregation in Montreal which is pastored by Bruno Leclerc and his wife Chantal, and they go back and forth. So they'll have a Sabbath in French and a Sabbath in English. It's a completely bilingual church. And I think a very interesting and dynamic congregation there. He also gets over to the Maritimes, which is also French speaking. If you go very much to the east there, in Canada. You get into New Brunswick and places like that where we have French-speaking congregations as well.
If I could just jump back to Africa, what was that one country that had this huge cathedral that you had a number of people?
Oh,
Is that the same? Is that where you are now?
that's where I am now. That's right. So there is, and again, I may not say it's either the largest or it's the second largest Catholic cathedral in the world, and basically it's either the Vatican or this one. And it's in the capital of Ivory Coast called Yamoussoukro, which is about 2 hours north of where I am right now. It can hold 200,000 people.
Oh,
And then obviously not inside the cathedral itself, but within the compound. And it was constructed by the former president, the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, who, as you can imagine, was a devout Catholic, and he wanted to construct this church in his hometown. And it is a truly magnificent structure in terms of its size and scope, but and I've taken people there before, and you can look this up, but it's hard to visit it and to see the poverty which exists all around, and then the opulence
hmm.
and the amount of money that it would take to construct a cathedral that could hold so many people and would be as lavish as it is. And so it is certainly a subject of controversy within the country, especially if you're Muslim. And I should mention here in Ivory Coast, they suffered a civil war, which began originally in 2002, kind of died down, and then came up again in 2010 to 2012, really over the issues associated with religion, Muslim, Christian, who was going to be the president, what party was going to control, and it really did affect our brethren. And spending on cathedrals of that size plays into that, that feeling of abuse of why did this country spend so much on a Catholic cathedral when half the country is Muslim,
Hmm.
these types of things. So it really is a landmark in the world, and most people are not aware of it.
One other question here, since you are in that part of Africa, I saw, and you did tell me before you went there, that you had a conference, a leadership conference, where you are now. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
That's right. We just completed just yesterday a 5-country pan West African leadership conference, a 4-day conference, Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire. We had more than 50 leaders there in this conference for 4 days. We were pleased to have Ray and Rhonda Clore. You might know that Ray Clore worked in the State Department, was
Yes.
stationed in places like Haiti and Cameroon. And so we had a good friend of mine from France, Jonathan Reedy, who came down to help me with some things here, and Verna Solozano from Guatemala, Leticia Demarest,
Oh,
who
yeah.
provided translation.
Hmm.
And so we had I think, an excellent conference, and we really hope that we can continue to do those kinds of conferences. Those conferences are made possible by the budget that we receive from the United Church of God for travel and for training, but also through the generous donations of people really around the world who look at the types of things that are going on here, and they want to be a part of them, because being able to pay for visitors to come or pay for people to travel from all over the region. It's 17 hours by bus from where I am now to where the conference was held yesterday. That's how all our brethren, how all our leaders from Côte d'Ivoire got there. They had to
Uh-huh.
take a bus.
Uh-huh.
And you can imagine when you take a bus like that, it only stops on the side of the road, and people basically, there's no toilets. They
Hmm.
just go on the side of the road,
Hmm.
and it does not stop for food. It just stops at control points, and people swarm the bus with selling food and drinks, and they reach out the window and grab food and grab drink, and then they just sit inside the bus. So it's difficult for our brethren to travel in these regions. It's routine to you stop, and they'll say, "What can you do for me?" And you pay a bribe to get through, and then you stop 2 hours later and pay another one. So it's difficult and expensive to travel because you have to pay for those things, and we're thankful for the people who provide the extra funds to do that, to have these kinds of conferences.
Well, I might just say too is that people have been very generous using LifeNets as a portal to help out areas in the world, including your areas, through projects that we've been able to fund. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the new borehole in Côte d'Ivoire that has just gushed, with water
That's
in
right.
June.
We are so thankful. We have a congregation in the far northwest of the country. This is a little south of Mali, and of course, Mali is quite unstable. This is Burkina Faso, which also recently just had a coup. Niger just had a coup. Gabon just had a coup. So we've got kind of a lot of instability around. So extreme northwest of the country, village of 3,000-4,000 people. There were only 3 water sources in the village, and women, they take their, you might say, jerry cans or other kinds of containers to these 3 water sources, but 2 of them quit functioning, and so with only 1 water source left, you ran out of water by 10 a.m. And they'd have to walk several miles to another village. LifeNets very generously provided the funds, and it's not an easy area to drill. We actually did hit water, but at 162 meters, which I think is more than 500 feet.
It's 532 feet. That's one of our deepest wells that LifeNets has been participating in.
And it was remarkable to see the drilling. I was looking at some of the videos of when you're going that deep. So yes, so now there's a second reliable water source, and I will be there on Sunday. I'm going to inspect some of the work. We're going to look to see how we might be able to expand some more access points by putting some more pipes in. It shouldn't be too costly to do that, so that people can have more access to that. And we have obviously the village chiefs there. There's 4 of them, and whenever I go there, I meet with them, and they're very thankful that water can be available and people don't have to walk so far in that way. So that it's an extra. You've heard these stories, and you publish them on your website of other areas, but water is just so fundamental to how we live, and just being able to get access to water there has made such a difference.
Well, that was really quite a story. And also, you talk about access to the water. You've actually had to build a road, haven't you?
That's right. We, in this case, to be able to get to a part of the village that was the farthest from the water source, we wanted to put it there, and it also was the benefit that it was on the church property, so we can have some degree of sort of oversight. Because, as you know, it's not just about drilling these things. You also have to maintain them over time, make sure that, the equipment is maintained and serviced, and the water is tested and so forth. And so this gives us some ability. And it also was in a location of the village where it was really the farthest from the source. So being able to widen that road a little bit, and LifeNets, again, provided funds so that we could widen that road so that people could more easily get to the source.
Well, LifeNets does very well when we talk about water, children, or education. And we want to thank all of our LifeNet supporters who have been so helpful, because we have responsible people that we work through. The senior pastors, such as Tim Pebworth and others in other countries in West Africa. We really do appreciate their stewardship of the funds to make them something which helps the community at large.
Yeah, and I just definitely want to second that. It has made such a difference, because here, so often it's just about a little bit of capital, a little bit of opportunity. People want to work. People really want to be able to do something, but there's so little opportunity. And so I think of a story of a young man in Benin, a very intelligent young man, and he had. I think came into the church when he was maybe a teenager with his grandma or his parents, and he just could not continue his education. And thanks to LifeNets, he was able to obtain a scholarship, and he was able to get a master's in physics, if you can imagine. And now he teaches at the high school and college level in Benin. He teaches physics, and with that job now he has a wife, and he has 2 children, and he has a small apartment. And none of that would be possible without education. And, that was provided through scholarships from LifeNets.
Well, to us, that gives us a great deal of satisfaction to do that. We have spoken about so many things, and there's still other things I'd like to speak about. And I know, Tim, we're going to have a sequel to this.
So many things around the world to talk about. Yeah, it's great. And I really appreciate just, having the chance to share some of these things, because each of us, we might be in the United States, or we might be in Canada, we might be in a certain place in the world. And yet, if we're in an English-speaking environment, we often don't hear about the things going on in French-speaking countries. So I'm really appreciative of the chance that you've given me to share some of these things.
I have appreciated the work that Tim has done to promote the gospel message in Europe. They have certain techniques that may differ from American techniques. And he showed me some videos of young adults groups and young adults discussions that were very, very impressive to me. And I would like to know more about them. I really appreciate working with young adults. And we want to find ways in which we can talk their language. We can communicate through their means, through their generation. And Tim has done a very, very good job at this.
Well, and I'll just throw in one thing. I'll mention, France is a challenging place to talk about faith. There was actually an article in The Atlantic in 2021 that was titled, "Why is France so afraid of God?" And I think it's such an interesting title, because I see that all the time. France has taken a unique path in Europe in terms of its desire to be secular. And it's a function of its large Muslim population. It's a function of its historically Catholic roots. But being able to talk about faith, talk about God, is highly challenging. And I'll give you an example. Last year at the Feast of Tabernacles, we were at a very nice hotel there in the south of France, and we put up a sign that said, "Bienvenue en France," "Welcome to France, United Church of God." And so, our visitors would walk in the lobby. They know where they were in the right place. A very simple thing. After 2 days, we were asked to take down that sign because it was a display of religion in a public place. Mm-hmm. And that's not possible. Religious symbols in schools like crosses or headscarves are banned. Homeschooling is banned except for cases of medical reasons. Mandatory public school begins at 3 years old in France. There's a big push to create this laïcité, it's called in French, or secularism, and to really remove religion from public discourse. And so it really does create challenges for us to spread this message. And yet the message goes out, and we still see people calling us, and we see, frankly, a lot of momentum going on in France. I think people are looking for something. Something's been taken away in terms of what, sort of God in their lives. And there's a sort of like, what is that? And they reach out to us, and we see the gospel going out even under these circumstances.
There's a hunger there that needs to be fed, and we have the food. And I feel like if we have the right combination, that we can connect the two. I mean, always throughout history, there has been the voice of God through various people that has prevailed, and it's survived countries, it's survived governments, it's survived ideologies. It's been there from day one. And I thank you so much for doing this, and you're continually in our prayers. Thank you so much for the time. Okay.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to us today on the Kubik Report. We welcome you to share this podcast and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and many other platforms. You can easily find us at any browser address box by typing in the words, The Kubik Report, and there we are. Remember, Kubik is spelled Kubik. So we'd love to hear from you. Write to us at vkubik@gmail.com. That's vkubik@gmail.com. Again, thank you for listening. Come back soon for more.